Okay, welcome back to Hand Tool Rescue. This specific video, I will focus on the muffler and the incredibly complicated carburetor. The muffler on most of these models and similar models from McCullough are toast, mainly due to the fact that you would go to put your saw down on the ground and it would lean left or right because it's kind of like a three-wheel car. And the muffler being really thin material would just immediately get crushed. So most of the ones online that I saw through contacts were just not perfect, and I wanted them to be perfect, so we're going to have to remake the whole muffler. Here I need to take the cap off of the carburetor just to get the rest of the carburetor off. It's attached to the main body of the saw and has a completely separate casting. Just one of a million examples of why this is a very odd carburetor. Once you take this bolt out here, you can kind of slide it around as you need it, but you have to take the whole gas tank off with it so you can get access to the fuel line that runs from the gas tank to the carburetor, or in this case, the sediment bowl, and then to the carburetor. The sediment bowl was not cracked, it wasn't missing, so it's nice that it was all there. The only thing that I think was missing were maybe a couple of little gaskets here, and you'll see me fix those later. So I put the entire carburetor back together so that I can reference later on the video of myself taking this apart, so I know where things go back together. And I just started pulling things off of this massive unit. Right here is one of the fuel mixture screws. It's so long, you can see the needle at the end. I don't know who designed this. Some insane human being who is probably laughing incredibly hard right now that finally he gets to see someone be frustrated by their own design. So you saw me take a little pear-shaped piece off. It's actually a really important piece. I didn't even notice how important it was until I did some more research after I took this apart. It kind of dictates the amount of gasoline that enters the carburetor, and I'll show you that a little later. Here's the air filter. There's not much of a filter. I don't know if there was one, but it just seems like a metal screen. There's no like really fine filter, unfortunately, so I don't know if that's just the way it is, but I just essentially blew it out, and that was it. I followed the manual and sprayed it with some gasoline, and that apparently is all you need to clean the filter. A lot of these screws had thread locker on them, which was nice to see. That kind of bluish tint is always nice to see on screws. That means that, they spent a little extra time and effort to make sure it didn't vibrate apart, which is highly likely with these old chainsaws with no anti-vibration technology built in anywhere. But what can you do? This is the primer pump. It will draw gas from the float bowl, the sediment bowl, and inject it into the area in the carburetor that we need it to. It's right here that I realized with all these little tiny holes that I'm discovering, I don't know what's what, if it leads to somewhere, a little tiny needle valve or a little tiny screen that gets clogged. So I really should have done this from the start, but this entire outside needs to be clean so that when I go to take this apart, I'm not just introducing more dirt and making my life even harder than it needs to be, because I'm not interested in that. Although I do this, so you can decide on that. The gaskets, luckily, I had the right thickness and everything on hand, so I could easily remake those. And then I could focus on making other gaskets instead of wasting my time trying to find suitable replacement material. I had the exact same thickness, so it makes life easy. So here's the float bowl. It has kind of a tension adjustment and then, or sorry, a screw adjustment, and then a little brass screen for the bigger chunks of whatever happens to be in your gasoline. I don't know what exactly is in your gas. It seems a little excessive, but that's why they don't really exist anymore. The inside of the actual carburetor, where the diaphragm is, was amazingly clean. So I'm super happy to see that. No major levels of corrosion. It was just a fairly clean aluminum or probably magnesium alloy casting, and it makes me happy. I still don't know what this piece is for. It's got to be some sort of quick access to something. I just don't get it. It has a seal around it, and it seemed like the screws were thread locked to house this together, and I don't get it. It's the it's part of the air intake assembly. Whatever. I just do what is there. So now I'm trying to take the entire air filter assembly out, and it's a little weird. This bar kind of just holds the whole thing together, and then there's a metal disc inside, which should have had a gasket underneath it, so that no, air can get through anywhere else but through the filter. But it did not, so I will address that later. Here's another adjustment screw. I'm trying not to lose any of those, obviously, very important. And I could finally split this carb in half and see what's going on in here, because I know it's just going to be insane. There's too many holes for this to not be a labyrinth of a disaster. So immediately upon opening it, you can see the very thin gasket paper. This was 1/128th of an inch thick, or 0.2 millimeters thick. I had a tough time finding similar or something replaceable on that I could use, but eventually I did. I gave this whole thing a massive cleanse and carb cleaner, every port, every hole, every seat. I just couldn't risk one speck of dirt being in this, because I would just cry, because literally one grain of sand can stop this whole thing from working. The filters are supposed to catch it, but you saw the filters, and they're not going to catch the finest of fine material like that. Here I'm just using paint stripper in a can. Everyone loves that one. It's made by it's made by Swing Paints. It's called Circa 1850. It works especially fast on magnesium or aluminum castings, because paint doesn't stick very well at all. You could probably rub it off even without some paint thinner. So I'm just going to remove the paint on the individual small parts. Because this is lead paint, although I didn't check it, I just already know due to its age. I just have to kind of wipe it all by hand, or at least as much of it as humanly possible. And that just kind of continues forever. So here we're going to finally have a look into this insanity of a diaphragm assembly. So this is the diaphragm here is connected to the ball valve, which is external of the carburetor. And you'll see me take that off soon. I'm trying to take this off really delicately, because at this point I didn't know if I was going to replace the diaphragm or not. So you might as well just keep it as pristine as possible, because if you had to use it, then you could, hopefully. Here, this is the ball valve assembly, or check valve assembly. I'm just trying to figure out how this comes apart, because I don't understand how it's not just coming off. I unscrewed it. But it started to wiggle, and once I got it free of the gasket, I could lift it right out, and you can see how this works. So in that little brass cylinder there in the bottom of the screen, you can see the ball in there, and that's what regulates the fuel flow. And you can see once I take this diaphragm off, the little arm that the diaphragm metal disc was attached to would move up and down and move the ball up and down, allowing the fuel to enter and to not enter as needed. There was a little bit of corrosion on this. I'm not exactly sure how that got in there, but it's not enough to affect anything, and luckily only on sidewalls and things that aren't finely machined surfaces. You can actually start to read the writing that is on here, which you could barely read before, and it at least tells you the idle screw adjustment, I think it says, or something similar to that. And that's the screw that I believe is still in here, and I kind of left it in there just in case the setting on that was specific, but I found some documentation on what that setting's supposed to be, so I don't really have to worry as much about where that screw, how much to screw it in, and how much not to touch it. Here I'm trying to figure out if it's, going to pump fuel or if it's just too loose. And I think it's too loose. It's not worth risking anyways, after all this. So usual paint job with aluminum magnesium parts, you have to use the etching primer. If you don't, it's not going to go well for you. And then I found some yellow enamel paint, which is exactly the type of paint that was used on this saw. And I'm painting it fully assembled because they painted it fully assembled. And I'm just going to try to match what they did. Here's, I haven't shown this on video before, but I've used it before. This is 2K paint, so a two-part paint. This is exactly like you would have in like a paint sprayer in an auto body shop, a catalyzed paint that is completely gas resistant and cures to an incredibly hard finish. I couldn't scratch my nail on it after 2 days, and the yellow paint I could still scratch my nail a little bit after like a week. So it's just fantastic paint. I'm excited to do more with that, but it is expensive, about 20 bucks a can. That's Canadian. Here I'm trying to melt what I thought would be soldering, but I realize on a muffler you probably need hotter than just solder. So it's probably brazed on, and the brazing doesn't seem to melt very easily, at least with what I have on hand. I could have got the oxy torch out, but if I'm getting the torch out, I might as well just cut it. So we cut off the garbage dented parts, and I'm just kind of inspecting what to do with this thing. And I first, for sure, need to address the kind of major dents on the back side. The back here, no one is really going to see. It is hidden, so it doesn't really matter. It's just going to bother me if I don't have a nice circular and not massively dented muffler. I don't know. It's just me. So I'm just spending some time cleaning that up the best I can, and I got it pretty close, I think. Next, I'm going to wire wheel this, try to get in every little nook and cranny of where rust might be, and get it shiny and nice. Then I'm going to fix the bent part, so on top of all the dents, the actual part of where it attaches to the chainsaw was bent, and I'm not sure if that was just leaking exhaust fumes and burning up paint and the saw somewhere else. But this needs to be as flat as possible because the surface it screws onto is nice and flat still, because it's a casting and is not really bendable. So I'm just going to sand it as much as possible to get a nice flat perfect surface, so when I go to put the gasket in between these two, we're not going to have exhaust leaking out the sides, because it's already going to be an incredibly loud and dangerous chainsaw. So we get to go to the wrench making zone to do some fancy machining. This is the top of the muffler, the kind of cover, not the sidewalls, the part that was completely gone. on the previous or the original muffler that I took off. So the wood isn't exactly level, as you can kind of see, and it and the metal itself varies. It's not perfectly flat either because it's just so thin. What are you going to do? So we just do a couple of passes where um, we'll go half the depth, see how it is, and then try to go the full depth, and then be done with it. Again, I didn't use coolant here because you want to see what's going on, but just to do the final pass and the rest of it, we just turn the coolant on and everything's fine. And it looks great. Um, then the machine just cuts it out, and then I'm done. If only life was this easy all the time. Robots are awesome. I think it did a great job. The pattern on there is from the original instruction manual that I have for this thing. So I tried to match the pattern as much as possible, so it works well. And then we just welded it up with a little bit of filler because it needed it. And then I'll clean up the welds a little bit, and that'll be it. The walls of this are thicker now. They're still pipe. It's a 4-inch pipe diameter, but the wall is some gauge that I don't remember, but it's much thicker than it was before. If I tilted it and leaned it on this muffler, I don't think it's going to bend or dent. It's quite thick, which is hopefully going to last a while. Here I'm just bending this casing, this kind of wire springy casing around the throttle linkage back into a relatively straight line, because I don't know how that gets bent so aggressively, but that's just the way it is. So this is the cap to the air filter. It also kind of regulates how much air is entered into the saw, but I was gonna just sand it up and polish it up itself, but when doing that I noticed there were really tiny scratches that needed to be filled with something, so I just put some spot putty, but I can't just leave red spot putty, so now I have to paint it. So I just use this paint primer in one. It's supposed to be good for plastic as well, and it's high gloss and it looks fantastic. So that turned out nicely. I did coat this with that gas resistant paint as well, just in case it got on there. Now to the diaphragm, the insane diaphragm. So it's riveted on with brass rivets, which are glued on either side to prevent any leakage of gas from one side of the diaphragm to the other. And these are obviously specialized parts, and I can't. Well, I could make new ones. They're not impossible. They're just little aluminum sheets. It's more that I don't want to if I don't have to. So we're just going to focus on replacing the actual diaphragm itself. And to do that, I need to get an accurate measurement of the thickness of the inside of the diaphragm, not of this outside thicker area, but the actual pumping area material. And it seems to be 0.3 millimeters, which is exactly the one that I grabbed. This material is nylon infused nitrile rubber. If you're searching for stuff, search for that. Specifically, I got these off of eBay. They came from the UK. Not very fast, but fast enough. And they're exactly the material that I'm looking for. It's nice to finally have a source for that. I wish I could find it locally. I don't know why this is so difficult to find. It's like a secret material that no one's supposed to own unless you're like a major carburetor business. I don't understand. Regardless, I'll do a little more searching locally and try to find something, because it'd be nice to just have a huge roll of this, and then I can kind of use it whenever I need to make a nice new diaphragm for something. I punch the holes with a nice hole punch, which makes life much easier. I guess you could try to drill the holes, but it's not obviously ideal. and I'm going to cut outside of the line in case my holes are slightly off, or in case my actual outline that I made is off in any way. It also looks like Alfred Hitchcock. Don't really know why. Another thing why I think this designer of this carburetor is an insane person. So I had some brass rivets. You're supposed to like put a rivet cap on the other side, but I just ended up cutting that off and peening over the brass until it was nice and solidly in place. And then put some gas resistant glue uh, over the whole area to ensure it didn't have any leakage from one side to the other. The only risk I'm running right now is somehow affecting the weight and the travel of the diaphragm itself. Maybe because it weighs a little more or a little less. I think it weighs a little more because those brass rivets are a little beefier. Maybe it won't travel as far and won't pump as much. It's just a matter of seeing if it works when I go to turn it on. There are instructions on how to make sure that I'm setting that correctly. So when I go to actually turn the saw on, I will have to either bend that little tab on one side of the diaphragm that it attaches to the arm that moves the ball valve up and down, and by bending it affects the travel, making sure that the ball valve actually fully opens and fully closes. Otherwise, it's never going to fully open, it's never going to fully close, which would mean gas leaking everywhere, flooding the chamber, and then nothing works. So it'll be kind of a trial and error once I actually get the saw going. This is the outside gasket that kind of stops any leaking out from anywhere around the diaphragm. And then these are the gaskets that I took off earlier for the primer pump and the ball check valve assembly. And here you can finally see the fully painted, nice looking chainsaw carburetor. I think the color is a pretty good match. I'm really happy with it. McCullough changed it like a million times over the course of history, and it wasn't consistent from saw to saw either, so I'm not really sure what was going on there. But, this yellow seems to match. So at first, I didn't have a gasket that thin, so I thought, hey, let's just put some liquid gasket, a nice thin, consistent layer by hand, and then that will adjust to the appropriate thickness when I clamp this down, and everything will be glorious. Well, that's not really the case, and I explain why. That's when I knew I messed up. The liquid gasket is silicone based, which dissolves in gasoline. Luckily, I caught it and I fixed it. Everything's okay. So rather, other than looking that like I'm dying, um, you just saw me explain what the issue was. Near the end of the video, I do take the black gasket material off and make a new gasket out of fairly thin paper. It's twice as thick as it needs to be, so it's 1/64th of an inch, but I don't think it's going to be too crazy of a difference. It didn't seem to affect anything that matters, and I say this now with zero confidence in that statement. But we'll see. If I have trouble getting this started, it could be related to that. I decided to swap out the weird gasket that was in there, which is obviously not reusable anyways, and went for some O-rings as a way to stop the gasoline from leaking out, even just one drip. I just don't want gasoline all over the place. So the O-ring should seal up nice, especially as I tighten this up. And I just like using O-rings for those kind of things. They seal well. And the Flopola just cleaned up. It literally just wiped it clean. Like, it was filled with gasoline, so it was pretty clean anyways. It's nice to have something clean that easy. Here, we're putting this part on. I still don't understand what this is for. It's a quick access. You could visually see the choke, um, but I don't know. Maybe you could take this off and spray some gasoline in there, but you could just do that on this side right here, that opening. I don't know. It's a little much. So we're just going to assemble the carburetor back the way that it's supposed to go and hope for the best. This paper does go on the bottom. I took a little time to make sure that that's the case. That's weird because it's usually not the case for most carburetors that I've dealt with before, but for this one, it is the correct way. And you can kind of see now how much extra material around the edges there is, and that's because I cut on the outside of the line. I could trim this off, but I'm just going to leave it because there's no specific reason to keep it or leave it, so you might as well just leave it alone. And it also allows me to adjust, if needed, these holes for the screws and things like that if I find that somewhere along the line, maybe that my diaphragm holes are slightly off and that's why it's not pumping like it should be. So I just need to have that flexibility until I know for sure that it's running completely fine. And there you can read at the bottom the idle adjustment screw. Here's another mixture screw. I'm just going to basically bottom it out and then I'll back it out as I need it to make it ideal for the amount of gas and air that needs to be mixed together. It's all going to be a little adjustment on every little tiny piece of this, so we'll have to deal with that in obviously a later video. I completely replaced this grommet because the other one is not adequate. So you can kind of see how long this needle is, and the screw, and that piece I was talking about at the start of the video, that pear-shaped piece that kind of turns the fuel into specific positions. And yes, I forgot the brass filter. People have already commented on me forgetting the brass filter. If only they watched the whole video. Finally, I add that O-ring to the bottom of the air filter because when I checked the parts manual, it says that there was supposed to be one and there wasn't one, so might as well just add it. I'm not sure if I was supposed to do that, or maybe this specific model never had it. I'm not sure. It cost me 3 cents to just add it, so you might as well. So this is what is called apparently just the pre-filter. This is supposed to filter out the large chunks. This is exposed to the air, like the direct air of sawdust and exhaust fumes and everything else. So this kind of stops the bigger chunks of stuff from entering the system. So this is almost more important than the little filter inside. Finally, I need to attach the throttle linkage. There seems to be 2 positions. There were 2 holes on that. I'm going to put it back in the first position, or at least what I'm going to call the first position. And then I will move it if I need to. I think it might have been moved because this was bent and it was all weird and the travel on it wasn't enough. But that little tiny amount really doesn't seem like it's going to help a lot. Anyways, but it's there if I need it. This is the primer pump. And then here, I finally take it all apart. This was like the next day after I woke up in a hot sweat, thinking about how I messed that up. So don't use the silicone-based gasket material. It dissolves in gasoline. I just piece it all back together, cut a new gasket, and hopefully everything's fine. It's just I'm sick of taking this carburetor apart and putting it back together. It's too much. Finally, there's the fully done muffler. I'm just going to lightly polish it up. Nothing super crazy because it's going to get ruined immediately when I turn it on. I dress the welds up just a little bit, and that's pretty much it. That should be sufficient for what I'm going for. I am excited, though, to hear what it's going to sound like. Anyways, I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you in the next video.